please. Okay, I'm speaking with Peter Bagge, and we're going to be talking about the Complete Hate, which is a deluxe box set edition that is coming out from Fantagraphics. November 24th is the date it'll become, as of that date, it'll become available. And I want to make sure, as just a mental note for me, to see how much we can delve into the actual book we're talking about. Book 1, Book 2, and Book 3 are all collected, and it's a beautiful presentation. If you wanted to maybe hold it up.
Yeah, sure.
Peter.
Well, here's the cover and the back cover, with at least on the back for those who are familiar with the characters. And then, I did new covers for all three of the volumes, front and back covers. Very similar to what I did with the Complete Neat Stuff, which came out a few years ago. So here's the first book collection with Stinky on the cover, and then George and Valerie on the back cover. And let's see, which one's next? And then volume 2 is everything from the color editions of Hate, which came out in the mid-late 90s. So there's Buddy Bradley's family is on the front. And on the back are his loser high school, go nowhere friends. And then volume 3 is, it has lots of odds and ends in it, but it mostly is the short stories from the Hate annuals that came out in the aughts. So that's Buddy's friend Jay on the cover, and there's Buddy's baby, Harold Jr. on the back. So there we go. That's all the artwork for it, the new original art.
Well, I wanted to jump in with my big question, and hopefully that'll trigger other options for us. And gosh, I'm just going to read my question. I don't usually rely on my notes that much, but just to make sure I get this right, I want to begin by exploring your sense of humor. And it seems to me a very good place to start would be Harvey Kurtzman. And I think I can stop with my notes there. What I like about reading the first book, one of the highlights is a direct Kurtzman reference you make. It's this pop culture expert, or so-called expert, and Stinky and Buddy go visit him in his home, which is overtaken by every possible pop culture item imaginable. And he happens to not particularly like Harvey Kurtzman. I just thought it was hilarious. And Stinky saying, "Who's Harvey Kurtzman?" And then you make another direct reference to Harvey Kurtzman and other stuff, which I would suggest to folks is a great gateway. And this is a really cryptic, hilarious, amazing little comic, What's in a Name? And I'm very curious about this. Something you did with Danny Hellman is the artist.
Yeah, Danny Hellman did a beautiful job, as always, illustrating that story.
You depict, of course, jokingly, with lots of love, you depict Kurtzman as this doddering, bitter old man. Bitter old man.
That was the Kurtzman I knew. I only met him a few times. I went to art school at School of Visual Arts, where Kurtzman taught in 1977, but I dropped out after only about a year. I'm perfectly happy that I did. I was planning to go back, but instead over time, I met a bunch of cartoonists, and they pretty much taught me everything I needed to know. Saved myself a lot in tuition money, just learning from other cartoonists. But every now and then, I still had my school pass, my student pass. So every now and then I would go and sit in on usually Spiegelman's class, but also Harvey Kurtzman's class. And by then I was familiar with who Kurtzman was. I hope I'm not giving you too much information. I had a drawing teacher named Jerry Moriarty, who did a comic for Raw magazine called Jack Survives. And he was a great teacher, a great guy. And when he saw the way I drew, just my natural drawing style, he said, "That reminds me a lot of Harvey Kurtzman." Being an idiot, I said, "Who is that?" And he told me, "Well, he's actually the person that invented Mad Magazine." I went out and bought, there was like this comic book just called Kurt's Comics that Dennis Kitchen put out. in the late 70s. I think Robert Crumb wrote an intro for it. And I immediately loved it. And it was funny about Kurtzman as well. I was reading these were like Kurtzman humor comics that predated Mad, I believe. And you could, just his humor, his pacing, just the way he phrased things, you could see Mad Magazine in everything. It was immediately obvious that the humor that is the earmark of Mad Magazine was right there, even before Mad started. It was all Kurtzman. So I realized, even though I had no idea who Kurtzman was, I realized that so much of what influenced me, all in a roundabout way, came through him. It was all via Harvey Kurtzman.
Well, there's a distinction. It was Mad Comics, and then it became Mad Magazine. And I guess when it became Mad Magazine, it became more mainstream, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yes, for the most part, I believe so. Yeah, it didn't seem to me to like there was Kurtzman was the one that turned it into a magazine, and then he walked away from it to do Trump magazine for Hefner, and then Hefner pulled the plug out from under him. And I guess the rest of Kurtzman's career has just been a bunch of no, I shouldn't say, but a lot of misfires. You know, he never became quite as huge as he should have, you know.
Well, the other huge influence, of course, is R. Crumb.
Right.
And well, there's no other way around it. You were editor of Weirdo for a time.
Yes.
And I had the treat of interviewing Dennis Kitchen recently, and he gave me his take on Crumb. He claims from his observations that Crumb was autistic or is autistic. What's your take on Crumb?
Well, they keep redefining autism these days, don't they? You know, now they have the spectrum, which seems to now that they've expanded it. I guess you could say that Crumb is on the spectrum, and I guess the more accurate term would be Asperger's syndrome. I could see that. It was funny, like as they've expanded the term autistic to include so-called functional autistics, people who are still able to hold a job. It suddenly seemed like it describes almost everybody I know. Almost every cartoonist and every comic collector, they seem to be on the spectrum. When I first heard the term autistic, it seemed like it described somebody who really couldn't function on their own, you know, like that movie, The Rain Man. Somebody who seems retarded, but who may be particularly skilled at certain things. When I first heard the term, I was listening to a radio show, and I heard the guest describe what Asperger's was and what functional autistic meant. And then when he launched into a description of it, when he described somebody who was a functional autistic, I was drawing at the time. I dropped my pencil and was just like, this guy is describing everybody I know. He's just describing everybody I know. But so I suppose Crumb could fit in that description. You know, he's lots of quirks. I mean, he's very honest, and he's famous for describing in detail his quirky personality. You know, his intense likes and dislikes, and how he is extremely different from the average person.
Well, one quality is being hyper-focused. I believe JFK was considered possibly having Asperger's too. So,
really? I'll be darned.
Well, let's hit this question: the provocative content in hate, and I see it as you wanting to push the limits as far as you could go, especially let's say in volume 1, the young guy just pushing the limits, but you're also expressing the American dream, and that carries on all the way through volume 2 and onward. Is that a fair assessment there?
I suppose, you know, but he's, for the most part, he's based on me. He's not exactly me, of course. But he does serve as a stand-in. So I relate to the main character, Buddy Bradley. I relate to all of his impulses. But yeah, he's somebody that at the same time wants to fit in, but also doesn't want to fit in too much. He even if it goes against uh, even if it's not like the wisest thing for him to do, he can't help but say and do what he really thinks. He's allergic to groupthink to the point of almost being contrary. You know, when everybody around him all seems to be thinking and saying the same thing. First of all, if he doesn't think it the same thing, he's going to let everybody know it. But also to the point where he might be willfully being different just to make some misguided point.
Well, I want to try to give people as full a picture of your work, since you're very much still an active cartoonist, creating amazing work. I want to jump to my other visual aid. Now, you're saying that Buddy Bradley pretty much speaks his mind. He doesn't do groupthink. And that ties in with your libertarian beliefs, pardon me if I'm mistaken.
Yeah, that I suppose, which isn't to say that, my political beliefs are entirely a result of me resisting what everybody else says. It's like my political opinions are innate. I've always very much felt like, for as long as I can remember, I always remember just strongly believing in freedom and individual autonomy. And to this day, I'm always surprised that everybody doesn't feel that way. It really shocked me as a young person. Like I would have arguments with my older brother, who had a bit of an authoritarian streak in him, at least when it came to like what he believed in. One week his hero would be Stalin or Mao, and the next week his hero would be Hitler and Mussolini, and then he'd snap back to somebody else. And and I'd be like, geez, you're all over the map with these tyrants. And he would say, those are my guys. I was like, for me, it's like, those are the guys that I hate. I hate all of them. I hate authoritarianism. And it would shock me. It would totally shock me that he would find anything appealing about them. He'd be like, they get things done. To which I'd say, they got horrible things done. And the same with, like, I remember talking, I was about 15 years old when Roe v. Wade went before the Supreme Court. So everybody was talking about abortion, and I was only just learning what that meant, what exactly that entailed. And I was like, oh, well, that should definitely be legal. And my parents are Catholic, but they were your typical lazy Catholics. They weren't particularly devout. But my mother goes, no, that's terrible. No. And I was like, really? You really think that? That's really a thing? That's not. And again, right now, I hope I'm not. I really don't mean to offend anybody who is pro-life, who is very against abortion. I understand people's reasons for it, but it's like I lived with my mother. I grew up with my mother, and it just surprised me that she felt so strongly one way, where with me, as soon as I heard about the issue, it just seemed like a given. My first thought was, I can't believe this is a debate. This is really a debate, that whether it should be legal or not. Mm-hmm. So again, that also isn't, I don't mean to insinuate that being pro-choice is a libertarian stance. It isn't. There is no libertarian stance about abortion. It's just way too personal a subject for anybody to put their political stamp on. But I just always innately felt that way. And I never made my character Buddy Bradley. He was never overtly political. He was, if anything, he was like anti-political, but he very much just wanted to live his own life, though. And I was always drawn to that type of people who are entrepreneurs, basically, people who start their own businesses. Like when people ask me about, I don't know if you intended to ask me about this, but so much of the early hates it's so associated in the public's mind with the whole grunge movement that happened in Seattle at the same time. And people would ask me, was I very much a part of that scene? And I wasn't. Even when I was young, I was already in my early 30s when that all happened. But even in my youth, I never went to live shows much. I wasn't a live music guy. I prefer records. Records have a volume knob. I can turn up or down. I can turn a song off if I don't like it. You can't do that at a live show. You can't press a button and make the band do a different song. But who I did know were all the who I was friends with. I mean, I knew some of the musicians, but who I knew much better were the people who owned the record labels or who managed these bands or who ran record stores and comic shops. It was like I used to call them the dads of the grunge scene. It was all the people who were exploiting the musicians, basically. Yeah, and those were my people. I was very good friends with a lot of people like that, and it was through them that I got a lot of story ideas. Like I didn't have a buddy join a band, but he briefly managed a band, and I was very inspired by stories that band managers told me and record label owners would tell me.
Well, my temperament would be where I probably would never have done that much in the live shows, but I did fall in with a really good buddy of mine who loved live shows. So I ended up going to many shows. The Crocodile I went to for just show after show, and we could get in for free too. So
who was your friend? Would I know your friend who?
Well, do you know, this is back in the 90s, Capitol Hill. Do you remember a record store called Sound Effects?
Yes, I didn't go. I used to always go to Fallout. I was a Fallout guy. I knew Russ very well.
Sound Effects, the owner, his name was, or is Mike Layden. I don't know if that name rings a bell.
No, I didn't know. Was that on Denny Sound Effects or was it on Broadway?
It was on Broadway.
Okay. Yeah, I would always make a beeline to Fallout Records.
Oh, sure.
I hardly ever stepped into their competitors' shops. Well, not on I wasn't like I was making a point. It's just that I figured that I wouldn't see anything there that would interest me that I wouldn't find at Fallout. You know, maybe I was wrong, but
yeah.
But yeah, I found myself at the Crocodile fairly often. I actually like the food at the Crocodile. I used to go there just to eat.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it was pretty good diner food.
Well, it's quite a ritual going to a show, and what I found annoying, and my friend would always say, "No, they're entitled. They're entitled." It was always a young crowd, of course, but then there were the older guys, the middle-aged hipsters who just like, and they were like trying to fit in and dance. They're doing their own thing. Said, no, they're enjoying themselves. Like, no, but it's cringe. It's cringeworthy to me. But yeah, they need to have fun too. But I was going to just show folks. These are the historical biographies that you've done as of late. And this is Rose Wilder Lane, Margaret Sanger, which I believe is probably the most popular so far, and of course,
yes,
Zora Neale Hurston.
Right.
In my theory here is that there is a libertarian thing going on where they're iconoclasts. They're bucking the system. They're going against the grain.
Yes.
Is that what attracted you to them? Or?
Yes. It was with those 3 books. Those are like my only full-length biographies. I've done a lot of very short biographical comic strips, and I still am doing them. But with those 3, I suddenly became very fascinated with the lives of mainly creative women, you know, some activists. But I noticed that there was a sort of a thing, and other people have written and commented on this as well. There was a bit of a thing that, particularly between the 2 world wars in the 20s and 30s, there were a lot of women who lived incredibly autonomous, active lives. They pretty much did everything that they wanted to do, and the fact that they were women didn't stop them from anything. For them, in their own mind, it wasn't a factor. And the best explanation I had ever heard for why this happened, because it almost seemed like there was a little bit of a step backwards, where it suddenly was like in a lot of women's heads that society was telling them they can't do this, that, or the other thing. But with these 3 women and a lot of their peers, this was like before second wave feminism. But the reason that I was told that sounded the most logical to me was it had a lot to do with women getting the vote. There was something that affected some women in their minds where, all right, we have the vote now. We won. We won. They suddenly felt like legally I'm a full citizen. And it might have been just in the back of their heads. It was just the psychology of it. But again, because the three women that I wrote about, they were living very independent, active lives even before women's suffrage. But yeah, I was just struck by their lives and just the way they thought. With Rose Wilder Lane in particular, but also Zora Neale Hurston, both of whom were mainly authors who wrote both fiction and nonfiction. They were undeniably libertarian. Some people even say that Rose Wilder Lane coined the term. They really hated authority. They were very suspicious of government. Lane she could be more accurately described as an anarchist. But she also recognized that anarchism, at least right now in current society, wouldn't work. It just simply wouldn't work. But to her, that'd be ideal. And the same with Hurston. I wouldn't call her an anarchist, but she was very libertarian. Sanger wasn't, but Sanger still led an incredibly autonomous life. And her mission in life, her cause, which was unhindered access to effective birth control, that more than anything else I could think of has freed up people. It made our lives, it put us in control of our lives. It used to be and of course, especially with women, they were slaves to their biology. It was very difficult to control when you would have a baby, and that's what she wanted. That's the life that she led. She lived a very free life, and she was, when it came to sex, she was very much a libertine. Not that publicly she would say but that certainly was a factor with why she believed in it too. She wanted to live that kind of life. She wanted to practice free love, and she didn't want herself or anybody else to suffer the consequences from that. But also for plain old health reasons and economic reasons. Poor women would be trapped in poverty forever without birth control. They just couldn't control it. So for that reason alone, I wanted to write about her. In Sanger's younger days, she was, in fact, the first half of her life, she was a socialist. She was very active in the socialist movement. Then for various reasons, I would say about like the halfway point in her life, like post-World War I, she stopped being overtly socialistic, didn't describe herself that way, stopped hanging out with members of the Socialist Party. But it's not like she became the opposite. She just simply became a pragmatist. From the rest of her life, it still was always about birth control, but she'll work with and deal with whoever can help her out. So it was very much a pragmatic politics for the rest of her life. Whatever would further her cause, she would do it.
Well, I want to jump back to Hate, the collection, and I'm curious about how far ahead you planned out the narrative, because it all reads really smoothly. What was your process? How did you plan it out?
Well, like when I did the very first issue of Hate, I was hoping it would do well. It did very well for an alternative comic. It sold shockingly well. Finally with Hate, from the very beginning, I was able not only to make a living off of my comics, but to support a family, which is what I was always hoping for. But I was beginning to despair. Prior to Hate, I was beginning to despair of that ever happening. Yeah, so I was thrilled with how well the first issue of Hate did, and I already had in my mind what would be happening in the next 2 or 3 issues. It wasn't until I would say got to about issue 7 or 8 that I suddenly saw this major story arc. Had a pretty clear idea of how those first 15 issues would resolve themselves. So I was thinking and writing very much the way TV shows are produced these days, like especially beginning with Joss Whedon, who did Buffy the Vampire Slayer. If you watch a season of Buffy, there would be a big story arc that would cover the entire season. There'd be a bad guy that she was trying to get at, and they would call him the big bad. They go, I got to get that big bad. But meanwhile, each episode would be self-contained. So there'd be self-contained stories, but still this overriding story arc would continue. And Buffy didn't exist at the time. Now almost all TV shows do that. But I didn't have anything to go by to do that with, but I was doing that anyway, and again, I wasn't doing that right from the start, but by the time I was halfway through, I was thinking that way. Like each issue is its own story, self-contained story, but I'm going somewhere. This is leading to something. And then, so I already had that template in place when I started doing the color hates, where I once again envisioned each individual issue would be a story, but then there was a second story arc that when book collections came out, like I think you were holding Buddy Does Seattle.
Yeah.
That's the first 15 issues of Hate.
Yeah.
And it does, when you put all those stories together, it does work as a graphic novel. And the same with Buddy Does Jersey. That was the next 15 issues of Hate that also works as a self-contained graphic novel. And then pretty much the same thing with all the stories I did for Hate Annual. That was in a collection called Buddy Buys a Dump. And that also sort of works as, there also is an arc there. It ended with a bit of a cliffhanger. And to this day, I'm still on the fence about whether I want to keep Buddy's story going, if I should pick it up again. The problem is with the Hate Annuals, each issue is selling less, to the point where I was like, this really isn't worth doing. People have lost interest in them. I didn't lose interest in them, but it's like, how much money I make is based on royalties, and it's like, this is just not working financially. I had it end with Buddy finally meeting his, by then wife, Lisa, meeting her family. He never met her family before. And of course, they were 10 times more dysfunctional than his own family. So I was really gearing up to wallow in the gutter big time with her family.
I wanted to ask you also about another process question. Did you get to the point where you're thinking, gee, how can I speed things up? Because you're an old school indie guy like I am. You want to do everything by hand. I think even the lettering was by hand, wasn't it?
Yeah, it all was by hand. There was a brief period where just in caption boxes, I had a font of my own lettering. And so there's these text-heavy comics that I had been doing and still am doing for Reason magazine. And I was just, because they were so text-heavy, they had such big, thick caption boxes, I was getting exhausted lettering those. And my editor, even after I inked it, my editor was always making copy edits. So for that reason, I had a font of my own lettering, and I would use that. Like I would scan the artwork into Photoshop and just type in with my own lettering, type in the words there. But you know what? Even though it was my lettering, I didn't like the way it looked. It still looked prefabricated. I have a unique lettering style where I go, when I embolden letters or put a word in bold, I don't use like a thicker pen. I take a thin technical pen and go over. I make the words thick that way, and it gives it this jagged look, and it makes it very emotional. It makes those words really emotive and really expresses what the person is thinking and feeling who's saying those words. And I just can't capture that with a font. It's impossible. So yeah, so I'm still stuck. For that reason, I'm stuck hand lettering all my comics.
Well, sometimes I wonder if it really saves that much time, because there's all sorts of cartoonists out there who they swear by just doing hand lettering. I can think of Box Brown, for instance,
right?
Nick Torkelson, just a whole bunch of them. They just swear by hand lettering. I prefer hand lettering myself, but I do think for the long run, gee, if I could just find ways to quicken the process, maybe even pre-made panels, but then do you really save time
Well,
making?
no, no, you know, that's just it. It's like, you probably, by doing it in the computer, you do save time. But there's another financial reason for me to hand letter by hand, and that is I make good money selling my original art. And so if I hand letter it, the hand lettering is part of the original art.
Oh yeah.
And if I do a font on the computer, I still have the original art page, but the caption boxes or anything else, it's empty. And so what I could do is print out what I did and glue them onto the original art. But then that's like a whole new job, printing it out, cutting it out, gluing it on. Then it is like labor-wise, then it is the same. It is all the same thing. And also people who buy original art, they don't want anything printed out and glued on. You know, they could see that this is a font that I cut out and glued on, and it lowers the value of the originals. So again, there's even more, just from selling original art, that's all the more reason to hand letter. That's all the more reason to do everything the old-fashioned way. I believe that almost all cartoonists under the age of 40, they probably do everything using the tablet. They probably draw everything right into the computer, and they don't touch a piece of paper and pen and ink. Everything is 100% digital. And that makes sense to me too, but it also seems so strange. Well, first of all, they'll never sell original art. There's not that artifact. Yeah. That artifact is missing. You could print out a page that you drew and sign it. I suppose that might be worth something, $10. Yeah, that's something that's one of the many reasons I can't fathom going fully digital. I was pretty much an early adopter with computers. You know, I was, unlike a lot of my cartoonist friends, especially indie types, who were a lot of them took this really staunch Luddite stand. It's like, I'll never buy a computer. You know, over time, almost everybody did. But I was not at all resistant to computer technology. And while I wasn't an early adapter, I was willing to try anything. If a lot of people were saying, "Oh, this Photoshop works great. This works great," emailing your artwork, you know, sending the artwork in digitally as opposed to going to the post office. That alone was probably the biggest boon. It's no longer having to pack up your originals, pack them up nice and safe, and hope that it gets to your publisher, who sends it to the printer. They get it back. They send it back to you. Hopefully, through all those steps, it neither gets damaged or stolen. You know, in that way, it was rare that they wouldn't come back pretty banged up. So to do that digitally, that is fantastic. That's one thing about the old-fashioned days that I do not miss at all.
Well, do you enjoy seeing your work up on a gallery wall? Because there's theories about how you read the comic. Is it different reading it on the page as on the gallery wall? I think it's a...
Yeah, no, it's like if I pass a gallery that actually has comic art on the walls, I'll certainly go in, as opposed to any other kind of artwork. I like comics. I'll make a point of going in just to see what's hanging on the wall. I don't necessarily, of course, it's not the ideal place to see or read comic art. The printed page is the ideal place. I really don't like reading comics online, and especially on my iPhone. I really hate looking at comics on my iPhone. And it's hard for me not to think that that's bad for comics in the long run. It was a medium that came into existence solely because of the printed page. So, and even I noticed that cartoonists some are, I guess a lot of web cartoonists, they are doing the comic pages vertically to make it fit the screen. The screens are vertical. But it's hard for me to think that way. I still always think of it like that, horizontal. No, I mean, I'm sorry, I got it backwards. I still always think vertically, and web cartoonists, I guess now they have to think horizontally. They have to think, go wide, do it in that format instead of that format. But I
Yeah.
still prefer, this books are in this format for a reason. It's easier to turn the pages with a vertical format. I know this. Maybe I'm overthinking all of this stuff, but
No, no. One other process question. What was it like for you when you shared the artwork with Jim Blanchard? Did you guys talk beforehand what you wanted to do, or how did that work?
well, how that came about was um, for, I don't feel this way so much anymore, but when I was younger, I would say the one aspect of the whole process that I felt like I struggled with the most was inking. And I was never totally happy with my inking. It always looked a bit more jagged than I wanted to. Something that's really terrible is like I had some cartoonist peers who's, my favorite cartoonists. I don't want to name names, but I was guilty of this too. We all were big fans of each other, but we also could be hypercritical. And part of that was we used to be unabashedly competitive with each other. And so a lot of cartoonists, maybe they knew it was my Achilles heel, but a lot of my favorite cartoonists would make fun of my inking. They would make wisecracks about how I would go about inking it and the cross-hatching and all that stuff. And I took it to heart. They would tell me years later, they go, oh, I was just kidding. I thought it looked fantastic. I was wondering why you stopped drawing that way. And I said, because you kept making fun of it. And they go, no, not at all. I was just being an asshole. But, and like I said, I was guilty of that too. Like with one cartoonist, I said, you started this one series and then you ended it. And the guy said, yeah, well, you picked on it. You criticized it. And I said, yeah, well, it seemed like you didn't know where you were going with it. It was, I didn't know where I was going with it. You were right. And I said, so because of what I said, you stopped it? And he goes, yeah. And I said, I didn't want you to stop it. I wanted you to keep doing it. It's like, oh my God, I feel horrible. Well, anyhow, I digress too much. With Blanchard, what happened, two things happened. One was my hang up about my inking, but also I knew that I would hate starting with issue 16 was going to be full color. We were going to try taking advantage of Photoshop and digital coloring, which made coloring an underground comic, it suddenly made it economically viable. And I always wanted to do a full color comic book just to try it out. Now that's commonplace, but back then there wasn't any indie comics that were in full color. But anyhow, with how people described the way Photoshop would work, and to take advantage of the bucket tool, you just click over a shape and it fills it. They told me you can't do that if you're doing all that cross hatching. Everything has to be really tight. You have to trap all the line art. You really have to ink really tightly. You got to make it look good without relying on cross hatching. I was really afraid I wasn't going to be able to pull this off. So meanwhile, I was good friends with Jim Blanchard. He was very good at inking. So I asked him, would you want to collaborate with me? I did very, very tight pencils. It forced me to do much tighter penciling than I normally would when everything was for my eyes only. Now that I was passing it off to somebody else, I couldn't leave anything to guesswork for him. But and I thought he did a great job. He did better and better too. It's like he was very frustrated. Jim Blanchard was very dissatisfied with the way he inked the first couple of issues. And I thought it looked fine, but he suddenly got so much better. I thought it looked great. So much so that when we reprinted The Color Hates into that book called Buddy Does Jersey, it was my idea to run it in black and white. Even though we invested all this time and money into coloring it, I wanted everybody to see Jim Blanchard's inking. I thought that the color was muting the great job that he did. Although in this book, with this new collection, we went back to full color.
You strike me when I look at well, here's one more visual aid.
Oh, okay.
Your collection of stuff from Reason magazine.
Right.
You strike me as somebody who has wonderful pet peeves, and so So do I.
Okay.
Can't hear it right now, but there's a lawnmower outside, and that's one of my pet peeves. I think in Seattle, we overdo it. We're trying to cultivate everything so it's most pristine and perfect. Because that guy was on his lawnmower only yesterday.
Oh.
There's a leaf blower floating around.
Well, that is, you know, it's a terrible thing about the climate. And well, I love the climate here more than any other part of the country I could think of. But do you have a lawn? Do you
No,
have
I live in an apartment.
in an apartment? You always, unlike the East Coast where I grew up, you always wind up having to mow your lawn here in November, sometimes even in December, because it's still warm enough for the grass to grow, but the rain comes in, and all just in October. I always think before Halloween, this is the last time I'll be mowing the lawn. You always have to mow the lawn 2 more times, and the grass is always soaking wet. I'm sure that your listeners will find this incredibly dull. But yeah, there's a pet peeve for you. For me, is having to always mow the lawn in November.
No, that's one of the beauties of hate. Your pet peeves are everyone else's pet peeves.
Oh,
What you're thinking, so many other people are thinking. So
right, right. Well, that's just like with that character, Buddy Bradley. When he started, he kind of started taking over Neat Stuff, my first comic book. Not just him, but the Bradley family, his family. They were just one of many characters in Neat Stuff, which was like a one-man anthology. And because he was the most like myself, I had more and more story ideas about Buddy Bradley. And there was this one story called Hippie House, which took up a whole issue. It was the first time I dedicated an entire issue of a comic book to one story. And there was a lot of things that Buddy didn't say in that story that were things that happened to me, things that I had done, and was, even though it happened when I was a teenager, and here I am not, you know, in my late 20s by the time I did the story, I was afraid to do it. I was like, oh, this is really embarrassing. This is a lot of what I do and say here, or what I have my character doing and saying. These are not my proudest moments. But I remember Robert Crumb convinced me to do it. He says that, he goes, if an idea won't leave your head, you're afraid to do it for reasons like that, but it won't leave your head. That means you have to do it. Those always wind up being the stories that you're glad you did. And that was true, because instead of people picking on me for doing that story, it was the opposite. So many people related to it. For the reader, as well as myself, it was cathartic. And that was always the case from that point on. That was always the case with Buddy Bradley. Even female readers used to always say to me, I relate to Buddy Bradley. Yeah, everything, even though he's a guy, everything he does and says, that's me. I think just like that guy.
well, I am excited for you for the New Yorker thing that you're working
Oh yeah,
on.
I'm not going to do that anymore. That Philip, I know it was too bad. I was like, I had a good story idea, but I won't go into details. I really regret that I ever mentioned that to anybody, because first of all, when that prospect first came up, I could not picture my work in the New Yorker, and then it turns out I was right. I guess the New Yorker couldn't really picture it either. They didn't turn me down, but first I found out it wasn't going to be in the print version. It was only going to be digital. It would only be on their website. Then they wanted to, even though I wrote it out and they accepted a script, and I wrote it out with a page breakdown. Then I find out too late they want to run it Comixology style, where you just see one panel at a time. So already my story was too long, and I hate that format. I still was trying to do it, but then, like, you know, when they edited it, they gave me one reason for some of the edits they made. They cut some things out and jumbled it, but it really seemed, I mean, they would never admit it, but it really seemed like they were cutting out everything that they thought somebody potentially would be offended by. And of course, with Buddy Bradley, that's almost everything. Although this happens to me all the time, where somebody will hand me some edits, an edited version of something I've done, and it's extremely rare for them to say I edited out A, B, and C because either it offended me or I think it'll offend somebody else. They always give me some bullshit excuse for why they made the edits, or pretend that that's the other thing. They'll pretend that they didn't edit it. It's like, oh, I didn't edit it. I didn't touch it. It's like, no, you cut out all the stuff that that will get me canceled and get you canceled. So yeah, but in doing so with the story, it killed the comic timing. The stuff that they cut out, it was just like, this doesn't work. This just it it ruined the comic. It's like you have to set up a joke, you know. And I do work page by page. On each page, I'm always, even though it's part of a larger story, each page I'm building up to something, and and both with the format and with the edits, it's like all the comic timing was just completely destroyed, and I didn't know how to fix it. It seemed unfixable. So yeah, I'm not going to do it. I just decided not to do it.
Well, that'll find a place somewhere else.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. In a way, I kind of, it was going to go back in time. It was the story was about when Buddy first met Lisa, the very first time they ever met. You know, it was kind of like Buddy Bradley's first week in Seattle. So it's nostalgic. It has some nostalgic appeal, but I had never done that before. I'd never gone back in time and revisited any of my characters, and I feel a little bit funny doing that. So in a way, I thought it was a bit of a blessing that I decided not to do this. Even though the story is funny, I was very happy with the way the story came out. I feel a little bit weird about jumping back, you know. And then if that did come out, then this wouldn't be the complete hate anymore. There'd be another Buddy Bradley story out there somewhere.
Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I had one other question. You can tell me if you think this is worth pursuing, but what was your rationale for George Cecil Hamilton? Did you feel I need to have a black character? I got to have George in there? Or what was going on in your mind?
Well, George was based on, he's based on a lot of people I knew. And he actually, more than anybody else, he was based on a roommate of a friend of mine back east. And that guy happened to be black. But George is like a lot of my black friends. Not surprisingly, I'm white. You know, I move in white people circles. So black people I knew, they tend to be, they are almost never black, if you know what I mean by that term. You know, their social circle is also white people, you know, even if it's white artists and white weirdos. I mean, they're black, but otherwise I have everything in common with them. And they also, like we were talking earlier about like functioning autistics, they also would have all those quirks. They would have those, they'd be also, more often than not, would be on the spectrum. And George, the character we're talking about, he's very much on the spectrum and has extreme social anxiety. So, I mean, it's a bit cruel of me, but just he already is like this social outcast anyway, and a weirdo and a misfit. But being black, that just adds one more layer of awkwardness. And I thought, so it'd be, for lack of a better term, it just amplified everything about him that made it. It was just one more reason for him to feel awkward, which, you know, it's not something I dwelled on, but I would throw it in there every now and then with storylines dealing with him. Like where he goes, it's probably my favorite issue of the early hates. He goes on a date with Lisa, who's a real weirdo. And and the date, of course, is a disaster. But at one point, she just, out of nowhere, she just says, "So tell me, what's it like to be black?" And he has no idea how to answer that. He attempts to answer it, but, you know, he's talking to a lunatic. I mean, it was a sincere question, but it also is like, when she's such a nut that she didn't think for a single second, she never considered, how is he supposed to answer that question? You know, and he doesn't owe me an explanation. We're just on this disastrous date, you know, and I'm just one more reason to put him on the spot, you know, when he's like totally miserable the whole time. And of course, he also is terrible. It's just one more reason to be self-conscious, even though he's in liberal Seattle, it's still white Seattle. And while he's going to and from the movies or out to dinner with her, he's totally self-conscious of the fact that his date is a white girl. So every pickup truck that goes by, he's just like, oh my God, you know, they're gonna point a shotgun at me.
What is your take on the current cycle of youth culture? Because everything runs in cycles.
Well, I'm not totally sure how you would
Well,
define what's happening in youth culture now.
well, without going in a rabbit hole, the whole woke culture,
Right.
is it
Yeah.
really
Well,
just,
I suppose young people, especially if you're going to college right now and are practically being indoctrinated uh, in that sort of thing. Um, I mean, that with the woke business, it seems to be affecting a lot of people. I know there's a lot of people my age who at least publicly will go along with it, but a lot of it is fear driven. Nobody wants their life and reputation destroyed. And that's got to be the case with a lot of young people too. I'm sure there's a lot of young people who just, well, I know for a fact, a lot of them are afraid to say what they really think. And eventually there'll probably be a backlash to all of this. It's so much of it has to do with social media. And I'm sure I'm not the only person to say this, but human beings, just our own brains or society in general, we haven't come to grips yet with social media. We don't know how to respond to it. When somebody tweets something, we overreact.
yeah.
Like with some of my comics I've done, like my publisher would say, "Oh my gosh, have you seen what people are saying about you on Twitter?" And they'll be terrified. It's like, oh, and not just scared for me; they're scared for themselves. You never know how bad it's going to get. And I'm like, I look on Twitter every day. I'm not seeing anything. What are you talking about? And so, I had to would have to do a word search of my name. And it would just be like a small handful of people who take offense in everything. It's something that and you could tell almost all the time too, that it's somebody would be criticizing my latest work. It'd be so obvious they didn't read it. So it's not like I'm losing a customer. It's not like I offended a paying customer. It's like this person just they saw a description of what my latest book is about online and decided to get on their high horse about it. And then a handful of friends would click like, almost like automatically, like, yes, like, I agree, even though I've never read the book either, and I've never heard of this guy that you're talking about. So, and I'm looking at that and it's like, this is nothing. I'm looking at nothing. This is a burp. And yet I can understand why, but meanwhile, my publishers would be so afraid, and I'm like, they saw this and they're afraid. But I guess what they're afraid of is this going to blow up? Is this just the beginning, And it hasn't. I don't know, I guess, knock on wood. I don't know. There's something I may be overly optimistic, but I always describe myself as pre-canceled. It's like just the way I present my work. I called my comic book Hate. That was controversial even at the time. A lot of what is happening now, it happened back then too. It is a bit cyclical, but there's always people who would take strong exceptions to certain things, the same exact things that people take exception to now. Finding sexism and racism everywhere, just permanently being on the lookout for it. That was happening back then as well.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there, and I encourage folks to seek out Hate, the box set collection.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. This was fun. I like all the stuff you have behind you. Who did those paintings?
Oh, that's my stuff.
Oh, I just saw it now. Crazy Cat on the bottom and Louis Armstrong on the top. That's great. And the other one, it looks like Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
And what is she facing? It's behind glass.
Oh, it's like just a kaleidoscopic, dreamlike scene of New York. She's hailing a cab, and there's a walrus inside the cab.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I know. Okay. Yeah, I'm seeing it now. There's a bit of a glare from the glass on it. But no, it looks great. All right. Well, nice. It was nice to talk to you, Henry.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.
Yeah, take care.
Okay, we're done. Thanks so much, Pete.
Sure. Thank you.